Hello, McFluffy52 here, back with some more Magic the Gathering action, and today I want to talk about how Standard is on fire right now. Today we're going to be playing a mono-red deck with a few new cards from March of the Machine and a few other silly additions. In this video, I also want to talk about the Standard format as a whole though, which has been a hot topic as of recently because of the changes Wizards of the Coast announced. Quickly going over the deck, we have your standard mono-red cards, but we're opting for additional burn offered by Invasion of Regatha, which can do 4 damage to our opponent's face and 1 damage to a creature. We can actually ping our own Feldon here and it will give us an extra card for a turn. We're also playing Stoke the Flames, which is supposed to be a great reprint for mono red because it is a flexible burn spell with Convoke that can deal 4 damage. And one of our fun cards here is Bloody Betrayal. Bloody Betrayal allows us to take control of one of our opponent's creatures and actually swing at them with it, and generates a blood token. This card is fun because it means we can potentially finish off our opponent with their own creature, and is actually a viable sideboard card for mono red against cards like Phyrexian Obliterator, which can stop you from attacking in. The blood token though can also help us filter away lands because we are running 23 lands, since our curve is a little higher than most mono red decks. The other card that we are running for fun here is Pyretic Blast. Pyretic Blast allows us to sack one of our creatures and damage our opponent equal to its power. It also draws a card. Now the real dream with this card is, that will likely never happen, is to gain control of our opponent's creature with Bloody Betrayal and then sacrifice it to Pyretic Blast, so that we not only damage our own opponent, or damage our opponent with their own creature, but we also remove it. This is very unlikely to happen though because it will require 7 mana to execute. Now, getting into the news about the standard format, for this video we're going to be doing the TikTok thing where I talk while the gameplay plays in the background, so please let me know if you enjoy the style of video. Perhaps I will do it again in the future if there's more things or news that I would like to talk about. At the Pro Tour, which is supposed to be the competition among the best from every region and leads into the World Championship, Rakdos absolutely dominated, representing a large portion of the meta, and 5 of the top 8 players were playing Rakdos piles. Wizards of the Coast announced at this event that they were concerned about the decline of paper standard play in local game stores, so they would be changing rotation to 3 years instead of 2. This means there will be no rotation of Innistrad, Kamigawa, Neon Dynasty, and new Capenna cards this year. Wizards of the Coast's plan with this change will give current standard cards more longevity, as one of the complaints people often have against standard is that it is a rotating format, so it's not worth investing in if their cards become useless or worthless in 2 years. Wizards also says this change will allow them to build more mechanics and archetypes over time, giving them more tools to build more synergy focused decks and leading to less mid-range good stuff piles which have dominated current standard. Wizards of the Coast says this is the first step among several they plan to revitalize paper standard in local game stores. Now, I want to share what I think and feel about this, as many people have had strong reactions to this announcement, myself included. My first thought about this change was how miserable it's going to be playing against the same overperforming cards which have dominated the Pro Tour for another year. Another year of Invoke Despair, Wandering Emperor, Bankbuster, Fable the Mirrorbreaker. My second thought about this announcement was, is this change really going to revitalize standard? It became pretty clear to me that this change, if made alone, will help paper standard at the expense of a large portion of arena standard players. Many people's reactions online were similar to mine regarding the dread of playing against Fable, Invoke Despair, and black-based decks for another year. This begs the question of, what has been killing paper standard? And one of the easiest answers to me seems to be Magic Arena. Magic the Gathering Arena can be so much cheaper because you can literally free to play the game and build a competitive meta deck over time. Even when spending on cards, it's mostly cheaper because something like Sheoldred, which in person costs you $71, only costs you 1 mythic rare wildcard. When cards become super popular and expensive in paper, they remain the same price online, which is an awesome reason why I love to play Arena. However, not everything is sunshine and roses on Arena. Players are heavily incentivized to win, not just for their own satisfaction, but because of the weekly daily reward system. This also skews players into best of one instead of best of three, which is the original way to play Magic and how the game is played in competitions and bounced around. The incentive to win, in combination with the ability for players to jam games as they please, leads to a competitive environment where the meta gets solved much faster. The ability to play games as you want is awesome, and the fact that you can be involved in competitive Magic environment so easily is a big plus for Arena. This begs the question, what does Paper Standard have that a player couldn't get online through Arena? The answer is not much. I personally feel like Arena is simply the better alternative for players looking to play Standard, and this change to rotation won't change that fact. What Paper does have going for it is the social interaction and the spirited experience from playing with people you might be familiar with at your favorite local game store. Additionally, in Paper, with price being a problem, you might get to see more fringe decks being played than players spamming an expensive meta deck which has found its way to the top of the food chain. Now, talking about other factors that have eaten into Paper Standard play, another big one is Standard leans very competitively, and Commander has been an awesome development for those who enjoy playing Magic the Gathering but want a more casual environment to enjoy playing their cards. Commander dominates Paper play because of this reason. Now, I will admit I am mostly an online Magic player, so I'm not super familiar with how Paper Standard was in the past and how best to fix it, but I found an article I think does a good job going over what Wizards of the Coast's next steps should be. Simply put, Wizards of the Coast are going to have to give players more reasons to play Paper Standard, but besides that, they need to fix the diversity problem in Standard. As Ramu writes in the article, archetypes in red-black spectrum made up more than 50% of the Pro Tour metagame, all with the same core cards. This core is so strong that it has its own variant in the Pioneer format, which is also the current best deck in the format. This is not a diversified Standard which players likely want to stick to playing for another year. I agree with Ramu in the article that Wizards of the Coast should act and ban cards to help open up the metagame, but Wizards needs to be careful and surgical with their bans to not kill entire decks or make players feel like they wasted their money on certain cards. Ramu writes more about the other changes they think should be made to Paper Standard to make it more appealing and easier to get into in the article, which I will not go into. If you're interested, I will link below for you to check out. Now, how do I think the 3-year rotations will affect Standard outside of the current played cards? I do think a large card pool will allow for more synergy-based decks and theme-based decks regarding like mechanics or tribes. For instance, in the Aftermath set, we got a new Vampire Lord, which would have struggled if the Innistrad vampires rotated later this year. However, I think this all depends on Wizards of the Coast's ability to design impactful and meaningful synergies in sets, not mid-range, generically good cards. Cards have to be more impactful than previous cards or respond to previous cards in a meaningful way to see play, which can be dangerous if this leads to power creep or an overcorrection from a card designed to answer a problem. Wizards' design process takes 2 years, so having a 3-year rotation will apparently allow them to see current standard sum when designing cards in order to address issues in the format. Lastly, I think this change is great for newer players or free-to-play players, which will have more time with the older parts of their collection. Now I would like to talk about bans, specifically cards that I think should be banned to open up format diversity and make Standard a more healthy environment to play in. Now, I know some people are completely against the idea of bans, as part of the game is sideboarding in responses to cards opponent is playing, matchups, and designing decks to counter the meta. And as mentioned previously, bans harm Paper players' collections and can turn them away from the format. Additionally, there will always be sets of strongest decks and cards in a format. But as we've established previously, the Standard meta is being strangled by a strong Rakdos shell, which is good enough to compete in other formats too. Wizards could leave the Standard meta as it is for another year, but I think it is in the best interest of the game to deliver a few surgical bans to bring the power level of the format down and open up other play strategies. With these bans, I tried to pick cards that were expensive, also see play in other formats to fit the goals of making Standard more accessible and not penalizing Paper players as much, since they could migrate their cards to that different format. When picking these bans, I also asked myself several questions about them. Are they shutting out other entire archetypes? Are they a must include if you're playing certain colors? Do they pose a deck building restriction? Do they have a casting cost restriction? What is their rarity, or how expensive are they? Do they bring meaningful synergies or themes to standard? I also followed the philosophy of picking cards that were simply generically good, could win on their own, snowball their play draw position or lead, are good from ahead or behind, and warp the meta around them. Simply put, like too mid-rangey. Now for the cards that I picked that I think should be banned, I saw a lot of options, but I tried to narrow it down as much as possible. First card I think should be banned is Farewell. This card is simply a mistake. Sweepers usually only hit creatures and pose a trade-off if you run into an opponent playing other strategies. This card has no trade-off. It is simply good. You can hit everything your opponent could care about besides planeswalkers, and on top of all that, it exiles. It doesn't really matter what happened the turns before it was cast, because now all that matters is planeswalkers and cards in hand. The real killer about this card is its flexibility to be a Swiss Army knife which turns into a one-sided board wipe against the right opponents. Like, green has a card that sweeps all enchantments and artifacts away for 4 mana and has a downside. This card has no downside, exiles, and can hit creatures and graveyards. The value is simply unreasonable and toxic for the format. Leave this card for commander players who want to ruin all their friendships. And on top of that, not every color or deck has good planeswalkers to play in order to dodge this card's impact. Next up, Invoke Despair. This card could not be more aptly named. The mana in standard is too good for this card to see its mana cost be an actual restriction, and this card simply does too much for its mana cost. It's basically always a 3-for-1, removing 2 permanent types that are typically harder than creatures to remove, and even if you don't have an enchantment or a planeswalker, then your opponent draws 2 cards and deals 4 damage instead. The drawing of cards on top of the damage is completely ridiculous because it feels like more often than not when your opponent casts one Invoke Despair, they must draw into another because they always seem to chain together. This card, despite having 4 black mana, sees play in 30% of all standard decks, making itself the 13th most popular card in the standard format with over 2,200 cards. The next card in standard that needs to go is Fable the Mirrorbreaker. This card is harder to see exactly why it is breaking the format because it doesn't directly cause as many feel-bad moments as something like Invoke Despair, which can kill you, but is simply a mid-range value menace. This card nails the need for an immediate board presence, can ramp you, fix your hand, and flips into a must-kill card that combos with a ton of enter the battlefield based cards in standard, particularly the most problematic being Bloodtithe Harvester, which acts as a repeatable removal spell and hand fixing engine. Fable is a good example of a card that is good from behind or ahead, as it provides a blocker, can allow you dig for answers when behind, or ahead it turns into a problematic creature that has to be answered. This card snowballs insanely hard with the creation of a sizable goblin which can ramp you over the course of several turns if not traded for. On a similar vein, another card that should have rotated is Reckoner Bankbuster. Now, I've seen people argue that how this card doesn't win games and therefore isn't problematic, but that is simply untrue. People play cards in their decks to win games, and if Bankbuster didn't win games, why is it played in 62% of decks, making it the most popular card in all of Standard? Being a card that demands play in almost all decks reduces format diversity. This card is overstated as a creature, providing a problematic blocker or attacker which can swing in super easily on turn 3, curving out and on the play. It also acts as a creature which is incredibly hard to remove and grants a ton of creatures effectively haste in colors which shouldn't have access to haste. On top of this creature feature, Bankbuster provides ridiculous value as card advantage, which can eventually ramp you and provide a creature to crew it. This card destroys plans based on holding up responses to your opponents like control, since while you're holding up your responses, your opponent can just draw and take over the game with card advantage. In that way, this card is shutting out entire archetypes. Giving such a ridiculous card advantage to all colors has led to this sort of mid-rangey, grindy format. I do not mind mid-range gameplay, and in fact it can be quite interesting, but it should not be such a dominant strategy. Next on the chopping block is Wandering Emperor. This card is insanely flexible for a Planeswalker, which is a card type which can be hard to remove normally. The Emperor can be held up as a removal and flashed in to exile a creature and gain life. It can produce bodies to build board presence and win the game. It can be used as a combat trick to give a creature first strike and blow out your opponent that way. This card can win games all on its own. How many other cards can you say that about? On top of that, this card punishes players for trying to play around it and not attacking in when your opponent has 4 mana open, because if they don't have it, you made the wrong choice by not attacking in. If they do have it and you attack in, you lose your creature. And if they do have it and you don't attack in, they can still play it and build board presence. This wouldn't be a problem if the Emperor was simply removal, but as it is now, the card puts the opponent in a lose-lose-lose scenario, with the only win being if they don't have it and you risk attacking in. This card practically demands slots in any white deck, harming format diversity. Besides the Wandering Emperor, another white card that I think needs to go is Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. I think Thalia deserves a ban as another card which warps the standard format because it punishes players for playing non-creature spells on top of being a good body on board. I think this card would make some sense if it forced more of a trade-off for players using it, but as it stands in standard, anything you could do or want to do in white with non-creature spells, you can do with a creature, with the existence of Brutal Cathar and Lorna the Third Path. You have your main forms of removal covered. There is little trade-off for playing this card while it cuts out entire deck types from being viable, like control. Now don't get me wrong, I hate control, but I think it's fair to say blue is the second least viable color in standard besides green, and that is in part due to that there hasn't really been any viable control deck in the format. Surely there is controlling strategies present, but as we talked about with Bankbuster, this format has demanded building of a board presence and constant pressure from players to compete efficiently. Thalia breaks control's ability to get any sort of grasp in the game because they're put behind a turn. This is true of other deck archetypes which rely on non-creature spells too. I do not think this card would be so problematic if it was not also such a ridiculously good body for its cost. 2 power and first strike makes this card hard to trade with for the same mana cost, and it gets even more ridiculous with any sort of buffs applied to it, such as the options available in Soldiers or the new Coppercoat Vanguard card in Aftermath. Returning to the colors that originated this discussion, Sheoldred the Apocalypse is another black card that deserves a ban. This card is demented with its ability to single-handedly win games for 4 mana. Not only is this card ridiculously overstated, being a 4/5 with Death Touch, outsizing most creatures in the meta, including green ones at the same cost, with green being the color of creatures that are supposed to be over the curve in stats, but this card also turns every stalemate into a win. Opponents are punished for drawing a card each upkeep, or drawing deeper in their deck to find an answer to Sheoldred. This card is generally a remove or lose the game card, and poses a huge deck building restriction for countless decks in the meta. This card is a must include in any black base deck, ruining diversity of strategies in the game. This card simply does too much for 4 mana, even if it's removed. It often does a ton to stabilize the board, removing any lead the opponent may have had. This card is the 4th most popular card in Standard, being played in 54% of decks, and it's also in the top 10 cards for both Explorer and Pioneer. I thought Standard was supposed to be the low power level format. Wedding Announcement is another mid-range, way too generically good, undercosted card with not a good answer to it, which I think needs to be banned. It snowballs a lead like crazy, you can draw cards, and it is still good from behind, producing several blockers, and it can be hard to effectively deal with as it is an end step trigger and an enchantment. I think when not including a card, when building a deck in a certain color becomes always the wrong choice, it harms format diversity, and this card simply does that. If you're building a white deck, this is probably the strongest option for a 3-drop no matter what you're doing in the color. I think this card would still see play if it was 4 mana, and also demanding a hefty price tag at $11 a copy, this card fits the bill for a good band to make Standard more accessible while keeping paper players happy since it can still see play in Explorer and Pioneer. Lastly, I think Liliana the Veil might need to go along with these other bands. This Planeswalker is too easy for it to become a 2-for-1 because in black the opponent can easily remove creatures on curve, meaning when Liliana comes down you are likely to have one creature and then it will be sacrificed to Liliana, allowing them to keep activating it. It can easily become remove 2 creatures, both players discard a card for 3 mana, or remove a creature, both players discard a card and gain 2 life because you are forced to attack the Liliana instead of your opponent. This play pattern would easily dominate aggressive strategies if the meta opens up with the other bands. I would expect this card to skyrocket in play rate as it fills missing spots in black-based decks with another high-value undercosted card. This card also harms strategies based on holding cards in hand to respond to opponents, like Control, as a stuck Liliana can eat away at any card advantage or hand. This demonstrates Liliana is a flexible planeswalker, which is, again, a card type normally hard to remove. Now, those are the cards that I chose that I think need to be banned to promote format diversity based on the philosophy I mentioned previously. However, please do let me know what you think in the comments below. It was hard to not just ban quote-unquote good cards, since then you have to ask the question, where does the line stop? So I really tried to justify why in the parameters of the issues with current Standard. Let me know if there's any cards that I forgot or cards that I should have not included. I will be happy to discuss in the comments and in my Discord server. Now comes the question of what can we do about the news. I've seen arguments being made for playing Alchemy instead of Standard because when rotation comes around, Alchemy will still be rotating along with some of the previously poorly designed Alchemy cards. This idea intrigues me, but I'm still hesitant to adopt Alchemy as a format since they print extra cards into it, which seems to demand more of an investment from me. Additionally, they advertise Alchemy as a digital format where they'll focus on rapidly balancing cards so that cards are not overpowered and the meta remains interesting. However, this does not seem to be what's happened in actuality. Cards like Crucius dominate and do not see intervention from Wizards, while Wizards randomly changes other cards like the ninjas. This seemingly chaotic format does not appeal to me the same way Standard does, because at least with Standard bans, Wizards of the Coast has to tangle with the idea that they're destroying the value of paper cards people own, restricting Wizards from making too many dramatic changes. Additionally, Standard being tied to paper means they cannot make excessively complicated cards, which are hard to understand since it needs to be possible in paper. I think there are appealing cards that have been made in Alchemy, but not enough for me to quite yet accept this trade-off. Another thing I've also seen being mentioned is playing best of 3, since you can sideboard in things to best address the particular meta deck you're facing. But this is a problem for a lot of Arena players because it greatly extends game time, which takes away the advantage of Arena being able to squeeze games in whenever. And Mono Red and other aggro decks struggle more so in best of 3 since opponents can sideboard in responses. Aggro decks are one of the best ways for people to grind their daily and weekly wins, which Arena rewards them for. These incentives are just like against playing best of 3, making it a tough choice to switch to, especially as a content creator where you need engaging videos, and seeing the same matchup 2 or 3 times in a row might not be the most engaging. Lastly, I've also seen people suggesting playing other formats such as Standard Brawl, Historic Brawl, and Explorer. I'd love to know all your thoughts on if you'll be trying other formats and if you'd like to see videos on them. With all that being said, there's a chance that this change of rotation simply works out and Standard becomes better than before, and if that is the case, I'll be happy. It is exciting to think about how a larger format might allow for some interesting interactions and expand the viable archetypes in Standard. Feel free to let me know what you think down below, and I would also like to apologize for not releasing a video the past couple of days, as I had to travel across my state to help a family member move, so I did not have any time to work on a video the past couple of days. Anyways, have a nice morning, evening, night, afternoon, wherever and whenever you're watching. Ciao. Why did I queue up into a best of 3 game by accident? Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. I queued up into a best of 3 game by accident. I need another video. I need another match for this video. Oh no. I have 0 sideboard. There's nothing to sideboard. I'm so screwed. That was a good draw. That was a good hand curve out. Like Blood Type Harvester, eat your heart out. Monastery Swiftspear is where it is at. Hold up. That's rough. That's rough. Yeah, that's rough, opponent. Eat your heart out. Eat your heart out, bro. Sheesh. Sheesh. The only thing could end everything right about now is a Sheoldred. You attacked in? Are you okay, opponent? We're going the Koth route. We're going the Koth route. This is so baller. You have no idea how baller that is. The one of fun of. Oh my goodness. This is a glorious game to end on. What the heck? Like that matters. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Submit 0. Oh, mono red, let's go. Okay. Oh my goodness. That's gonna be a bonus footage at the end of this video. That was glorious. I guess best of 3 isn't that bad. You don't even need a sideboard. Alright. Have a nice morning, evening, night, ciao. All that good stuff.